Welcome to another episode of 30 Minutes in the New Testament. 30 Minutes in the New Testament is a 1517 Podcast Network podcast. You can go to 1517.org/podcast and check out all those other podcasts that are living over there. 40 Minutes in the Old Testament, Thinking Fellows, Tough Text. I mean, if you like these guys, all those podcasts have one of these guys on it, so you should check it out. Also, check out all the articles, all the academies, all the videos, all the stuff that we're doing, the events, and, of course, check out the donate link. You want to check out that so that we can keep all this stuff free coming to you. You can become a supporter by going to that link. You can give a one-time gift, reoccurring gift, however you want to do it. We appreciate it very much. Thank you to those that do that. Guys, we are in Matthew chapter 16. We are at verse 21. Little recap here because it is important, is that, Jesus just took his disciples aside and said, hey, I got a question. Who do people say that I am? What's the rumors out there? What are people saying? And they're like, oh, man, well, some people are saying a lot of good things about you. I mean, they're saying Jeremiah, Elijah, John the Baptist, one of the prophets. I mean, all good things, man. I mean, these are all solid things to be called. And Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And then Peter speaks up, and this is one of those times where Peter nails it. And he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, hey, man, you're blessed. And the reason I know you're blessed is that there's no way that you came up with that on your own. I've known you long enough to know that didn't come out of your heart all by itself. This was revealed to you by my Father who is in heaven. And I'm going to build my church on that confession, on that truth. I'm going to build my church on who I am. That's what I'm going to build the church on. And then he says to everyone, also, don't tell anyone that this is the case because you guys aren't really ready to tell anybody anything yet. And so we pick it up at verse 21, and the important thing to know is that Peter's got to be feeling pretty good at this moment. Like he finally got like an attaboy, right? Like he nailed it, and he's like, all right, like I was willing to speak up, got it right. Jesus just called me blessed. I mean, like God is like showing me his favor. So I feel pretty good about that. And now Jesus is going to tell them something that they really don't want to hear.
Indeed. So it says, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Oh, well, how the tables have turned so quickly.
Well, I think one of the important things, too, that sometimes people don't connect these things in these kind of two texts because you got this little break and this little header in there and stuff. But Jesus just got done saying, hey, I'm going to build my church on this confession here, that I'm the Christ, the Son of the living God. You know what else I'm going to build my church on? I'm going to build my church on this, that I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer and die, and I'm going to rise again. This is what the church is going to be built on. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is what it's all about. Now, Peter's down for the this is who I am, not so down for the this is what that means, right? Down with the first part. Oh, I mean, I like that you're the Son of the living God.
Yeah.
There's a lot of power.
That suggests some real power.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty good. It's like, yeah, what that means is that I'm the one who's going to go and suffer and die. But it even includes I'm going to rise again. But Peter says, and you got to, it is wild that Peter's like, come over here. Come over here. I don't want the other guys to have to see me do this to you. Let me tell you, though, that's never going to happen.
The choice of words it's not just far be it from you. It's far be it from you, Lord. I mean, so there's this recognition that, like, I'm speaking to the Lord, and yet I think that I have the authority to declare to the Lord what he is going to do and what he is not going to do.
Yeah, and it is interesting that Matthew uses the word rebuke here, right? So Peter took him aside and rebuked him, right? So, again, I mean, this is Peter saying, I really want to embarrass you in front of the other guys, but I'm about to have to give you the hard word, Lord.
That's not the way the Messiahship works.
That's not the way the Messiah is supposed to talk.
Yeah, that's right.
I think I love this this chapter of Matthew because it's sort of one of the culminations of Jesus trying to turn these guys into preachers. And you get like a glimpse that they think they're ready. And he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, yeah, man, you nailed it. I'm going to build my church on that rock right there, that rock of that confession. But then he knows that they're, at the end of the day, not ready, and that they don't even know what that confession is to which he just referred and on which he's going to build his church. They don't get that. They get, like Dan said, the one part of it, but not the other. So he strictly charges the disciples not to tell anyone about this, that he's the Christ. Well, why? Well, because if they say, hey, this is the Christ, and then people start asking them questions about what that means, they're going to get it wrong. Yeah. And the reason they're going to get it wrong is because right after that, when Jesus tells them what it means, they're likely all pretty upset by it. But Peter, being Peter, is the one who's sort of, he
can't hold back.
He can't hold back. He's got the temerity to step up and say, "Yeah, come here. We need to have a little chit chat over here, because this isn't going to happen." And Jesus' response is just so clear, and the response is this: if you deny the gospel, you're Satan.
Yeah,
and it's Satan that's working in you. And if you deny even the primacy of the gospel, the reason I came, you're doing Satan's work. And when I think about this, I think about sort of everybody today within Christianity who really makes solid attempts to make Christianity about anything other than Jesus' death and resurrection.
Yeah.
And to sort of start adding on to it. And you can see here Jesus' reaction to that.
There simply is no Christ apart from his cross. It does not exist.
Yeah,
and any time that we try to divorce Christ from the cross, we are in fact doing the work of the devil.
Yeah, because the devil would love you at the end of the day to, be all sorts of things that might look to our sinful eyes like they're okay or even good. Even participating in various kind of worship and religious practices. But those religious practices aren't the worship of Christ, and they don't lead you to Christ. Then they are a hindrance to him, right? Get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me. You don't actually have your mind on the things of God, because if you knew what God's intention was, you'd know that it would be for me to suffer, die, and rise again on the third day as the first fruits of your resurrection. But since you don't know that, you're an absolute hindrance.
Yeah. I mean, well, it is wild that you can, in a matter of moments, have a confession placed in your mouth by God, and then have a confession placed in your mouth by the devil, right? I mean, and this is what Jesus is doing here. Is he's saying, that first thing, you didn't know that by yourself. That was put there by my Father. This thing that you're doing right now, that was put there by the devil. Like, that's the devil talking right there. That's devil talk, right?
If you ever wanted to see kind of a concrete example of what we call the simile for shorthand, the fact that people are simultaneously saints and sinners, just read these passages back to back.
I'm going to remember that, because you typically drive people to Romans 7. This is a little more practical.
Yeah, this is just very concrete. Like, this is what it looks like. On the one hand, you're capable by the grace of God, by the power of the Holy Spirit, you're capable of saying something really amazing and true, and yet the very next breath saying something incredibly wrong and incredibly dumb.
That you could literally say something that Jesus is like, that sounds like my Father. And then the next moment, that sounds like the devil, out of the same mouth.
Eric, the reason that's such a good example that you brought up is because when we talk about the simile, people usually, because you're going to say something like saint and sinner, justified and sinner, something like that, right, to describe it. And when people do that, they usually connect that to like horrible outward sin that you're not even necessarily talking about. You're not talking about that you're going to be a Christian, and at the same time, Dan and I were talking about this on the phone yesterday. At the same time, your life is completely disordered. Your life is completely dysfunctional. Your life is completely, horrible, and something that you wouldn't ever want to point somebody to emulate. That's not, at the end of the day, what you're necessarily talking about with the simile. You're talking about the fact that you vacillate between, complete trust and reliance on the fact that Christ is your only hope for salvation, and this nagging desire to be your own salvation.
Yes.
and to let your own ideas of salvation reign.
And that's especially relevant when we move on to the passage right after this one, too. It really demonstrates why we're so prone to getting it wrong.
Well, that's what Jesus does here. Is what he's about to do is, you might think that Peter, and I'm not saying that there's none of this, but that Peter is saying, "Oh, I love you so much, Lord. I would never let anyone, harm you." And this has a lot to do with Jesus. But what Jesus is going to do is say, "No, like for you to accept what I just said, this is actually going to take a death to self. You're going to have to die to all your ideas of what God is like and what salvation is like and what my whole agenda is.
And what your part in it is like.
Yeah, this is
I
all
think
going to be a death.
your part in it.
Just a couple of things about this passage before we move on. I think it's important to note the language of verse 21. It does say Jesus began to show his disciples. Well, how does he show his disciples in other spots about the necessity for his suffering, death, and resurrection? Well, he opens up the scriptures to them. Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine him quoting from like Isaiah 53 or something and saying, you see this? This is what this is about. You can imagine him pointing them to the Old Testament. And then the second thing to note is that he says he must go to Jerusalem, and that he's showing them that it's a necessity, like that he has to do this.
Well, that's a point with saying that if you are teaching Christ incarnation for any other reason, you're really missing the point of even what he said about what was necessary.
That's right.
Like, it's not like he said, well, this was one option out of 100, and we rolled the dice and we went with this one. But I could have come and just been a great moral example and really inspired you guys to follow me and be better moral people, and that would have worked too.
Yeah.
Or, he said, no, this is what has to happen. It has to happen this way.
Yes.
Like this is the only option.
Yeah.
Well, and you see this so clearly when especially when he's on trial with Pilate. Mm-hmm. He just has no intention of stopping this. I mean, this is the goal. Right?
Yeah.
Like, he is here to die, and he doesn't even attempt to stop it from happening.
Well, it's the famous break in Luke chapter 9, right, where we go from Jesus ministering in other parts of Israel, Galilee, etc., to Luke 9:51, where it says he set his face toward Jerusalem. Yeah. He's just bound and determined to get there, and it's for this purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So none of this is ever accidental. He's not surprised by any of it ever. He's still in control the entire time. Nevertheless, disciples don't want that. And so Jesus has to go into further explanation here as we pick it up in verse 24. It says, "Then Jesus told his disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.'" So what does he mean here by one must deny himself, take up the cross, and follow him? Is this alluding to the fact that we must be obedient to him in order to be saved? I think a lot of people read it that way. What say y'all?
Well, no, the denying that's taking place here is you're gonna have to put down all your self-salvation projects, and to put down everything that you would think would justify you and embrace this thing that you really don't want to embrace, which is that through this one person's death and resurrection, this is how one is saved. This is how one's life is saved. And it's the only way. And this is why he says, like, look, you could try to do it any other way. You could give up all kinds of other things and not embrace this thing. And here's what's going to happen. On the last day, everyone's going to be judged according to what they've done. And you could either have tried to do a bunch of things in order to be justified, or you could embrace this one thing. So here's your options. Be judged according to what you've done, or embrace this one thing, which is that I am going to Jerusalem to suffer and die and rise again.
Yeah.
Those are the options. There is no other options.
And it's interesting here, too. I mean, just think about the conception that the disciples have of the Messiah. They think that the purpose of the Messiah is to, in fact, gain the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
That's
of course
what they see.
Want him to turn his face towards Jerusalem because they think that when he heads to Jerusalem and he's
going there to
enters
conquer
triumphantly, that triumph is going to continue, right? That it's going to cause a wave of triumph that's going to overcome Herod and his evil rule. It's going to overcome the Romans and kick them out, and that it's going to set up this perfect theocracy, civil theocracy here on earth that's going to put, their conception of the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham finally, at its place where it should be, which is at the end of the day, I think what he's saying specifically to them, to us too, but to them when he says, you got to lose your life, and your entire culture in life is set up at this one aim that has not ever been the reason why God promised to send the Messiah.
Yeah, well, Scott, this is like some real theology of glory versus theology of the cross stuff here, where like you have a split.
And that's only going to increase in the next passage, by the way.
Yeah, you have this split in the road where it's like you can either embrace this idea of, we would say like a Christian life or Christianity, but in here he said you can embrace this idea of God that you're going to be saved, and you're going to be saved through conquering. And you're going to be saved through power and all this stuff, or you could embrace the true thing, which is that you're going to be saved through the suffering and death of Christ. And what it's going to do is remove any role for you to play in your own salvation, and the only thing left for you to do is die.
Well, and for them specifically, I mean, that's absolutely how we should think about this, because we don't have this like great sense of corporate salvation that the Jews of his time would have had. I mean, he's got to break them of the idea that they were sustained even in a remnant, because they're going to, at this point, I mean, you guys know this better than me. At this point, their existence, they believe, even as a remnant, is so that this Messiah can come and take over all things.
Yep.
Like all things earthly are going to, in a civil function, be put under his feet. He's in the process of trying to teach them that this remnant was only spared so that I might be revealed at the perfect time, right? Or at just the right time, right? Well, what does just the right time mean? Well, we can speculate on that, but one of the things that just the right time might actually mean is that the Roman Empire is here, and that it's got, that it's going to give people like Paul the means, the mechanism, and the ability to take this gospel everywhere. In their known world once it's done. I mean, a lot of them are going to do. It's not just Paul. A lot of the people standing there are going to participate in this, taking the gospel to their entire known world at the time, which would not have been possible without certain infrastructure and ability to travel and, some safe roads and all this stuff. That just is not the case. And so they're having to be like, this is a literal death.
Yeah.
Like, this is like a literal death to everything they thought was normal. And we can think of that, but when we think about it, we only think about it like on the church side. Like when we're even doing this sort of theology of glory versus theology of cross with people, we're kind of just, we're trying to teach them to think about the way of their salvation differently. He's trying to teach them to think about not only the way of their salvation differently, but the reason their culture exists differently. And that's for them
upending
specifically,
their whole identity.
It's a literal death. Like their whole identity, religious identity, civil identity. I mean, it's true for us too, but I think they faced it hard. Has to die.
Yeah, and there's also a very literal interpretation of this, like for someone like Peter, who just made this sort of like, this isn't going to happen, and Jesus like,
you're gonna die.
This is the devil talk. Well, Peter is going to literally take up a cross and follow Jesus.
Yes.
Like, this is literally going to happen to him.
And I think that's so important too. And you and I were talking about this yesterday on the phone, Dan, is that when we look at these things, we really, and this isn't us being like weird Bible historians, you really have to understand that he is, when he first says these things, talking to a specific group of people.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, with the exception of one
with
guy
particular
here,
struggles.
Yeah.
With particular misunderstandings.
Yeah. And he's talking to a group of guys all with the exception of one, who are all going to
die.
Actually die for this. Like, they are going to be martyred. And John probably wishes he was one of them, because I'm not sure he doesn't get the worst lot, which is exiled on Patmos and just like watching all his brothers become martyrs and him just having to hang around. I'm not sure that's even that he wins that arrangement.
No, I mean, that's like the gospel reading from this past week in Mark 13 says the exact same thing. You know, you're gonna see family turn against family, father against son. You know, all this. Well, we're all going to see that when the gospel is preached in all of its purity. But they specifically actually could look back on their lives and tell you the times that they saw it.
Yes. Yeah. It's a couple other things before moving on here to the next passage. Again, Jesus is essentially saying here, if I'm that kind of Messiah that gains the whole world, the problem with that, boys, is your souls still don't have atonement.
Yeah.
That's really the big idea here. And then number two, you say, well, okay, all these disciples here are actually literally going to die. Where do we die as his disciples? And of course, if we go to Romans 6, we find the answer to that question, and that is in our baptisms. It begins in our baptism, and this is why Martin Luther would say things all the time like, remember your baptism when you wash your face or whatnot. It's a daily practice of remembering that you're dead to sin and alive to Christ.
Yeah, I think that baptism is a denial of self.
100%.
That's what it is. Where like you are when you go to be baptized, or when someone takes you to be baptized, they are denying. It is a denial of self and an embracing of the cross. We do probably have to address this like little troublesome text here in 28 that makes people scratch their head.
No, they
and
do.
He says that hey, there's you're standing here and you might not taste death until they see the man coming in his kingdom. And you're like, wait a minute now, that sounds like the second coming, and I think all of these guys are dead.
Well, I'm going to argue that this is one of those times where it's a very unfortunate chapter break, because it's not an accident that right after he says that some standing here are going to see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, which is another way of saying like coming in his glory, immediately after 6 days, Jesus takes three of them, Peter, James, and John, leads them up on a mountain, and the transfiguration takes place.
Yeah.
I think this is an allusion. Sure, it could be about the second coming. It could be. This is the language that's often associated with the second coming. But I think it's just talking about the transfiguration.
Peter gets a lot of investment for not always a lot of payback.
Well, yeah, and
eventually
see that
eventually
again
it comes, but he gets a lot of investment.
I think this is also doubly true of John, who does sit there on the island of Patmos and does in fact you have the letter of Revelation and does in fact see Christ coming in his kingdom in quite detail, right? And he will, and John will not die before he sees that.
That's interesting.
Yep. So I think both those things are true, and it's not an accident that John is at both of these events. And it's also not an accident that when you look at Peter and John's letters later on, they will highlight this moment as being a very, very significant sort of clarifying moment for them. Yeah. Because they do see him in his glory. And so picking it up at verse 1 of chapter 17, it says, and after 6 days Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. This is, by the way, the same picture that John does see of Jesus on the Isle of Patmos. He looks the same. Verse 3, and behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Now, why and what is the significance of Moses and Elijah suddenly showing up talking to Jesus?
The law and the prophets.
Amen. Yeah. So these are the sort of, the pinnacle pictures of the representatives of the law and then the ultimate prophet. And both of them are there. And what are they doing? Well, it's interesting. Matthew doesn't tell us specifically what it is they're talking about, but Luke does. And Luke tells us that they're specifically talking about his quote-unquote exodus, or his departure. The word there in Greek is actually exodus. What do the law and prophets want you to focus on? Again, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, because the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of everything that they wrote, everything that they preached. It was all pointing to the departure or the exodus that Jesus is going to accomplish for sinners. Of course, Peter does not understand this at all. Because verse 4 says, "And Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah.' He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.'" Now, I think that that's specific to listen to him right now. What is he talking about, Peter? He is not talking about having a comfortable campground on top of the mountain with the law and the prophets. He is talking about being the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, and how is he doing that? By going to die for your sins, Peter. Listen to him. Would you stop talking for just a second? Just listen to what he's saying.
I think, too, like, the law with Moses and Elijah, one of the things that you have with them, too, I mean, Moses is often, like this picture of the chief representative of the law, and Moses was killed by God, essentially. He was taken up on a mountain, and there he died, and God himself buried Moses, nobody knows where.
And hid him.
Yeah, hid him. So Elijah was taken to heaven in a whirlwind, right? You can't go to the grave.
You can't find
of
these two people.
You can't find them. And so, and now here they are, like with 2 people that God took, essentially, right? And now here they are. And of course, the law and the prophets all point to Jesus. This is, of course, true. Peter seems to think that he's seeing something, and this word here, like tents, like what he wants to do is make like these little tabernacles for them, right?
Yeah.
And in Peter's mind, still, these 3 people are the same. Or it's like, I'll make 3 of them. Like this is the Trinity to Peter. Peter is saying, like, these are all equal.
Yes.
And God says that, no, they're not. You have 3 people here. He doesn't say, that's Moses, listen to him. And he doesn't say, that's Elijah, listen to him. He says, look, man, this is the law and the prophets and the Messiah. And I'll tell you which one to listen to. It's my son. That's the one. And I think that, like, you sort of have this, this fulfilling, but when you hear, Paul say that, like, Christ is the end of the law and this kind of stuff, what's happening here is, like, you have, like, these 2 pillars of the faith, like the law and the prophets, and God is literally saying, like, that is ended. These all now are subservient to this one thing, which is this is my son. I'm pleased with him. Not pleased with with the law or the prophets apart from Christ. I'm not pleased with Moses or Elijah or anyone else apart from Christ. Like, this is the one with whom I'm pleased. This is the one to listen to.
To use the language of Hebrews, Moses and Elijah are the shadows.
Yep.
The substance is Christ.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, in interesting side note, in Luke's version too, when Peter is speaking, Luke just happens to add, Peter, not knowing what he was saying.
Yeah.
Which I thought was hilarious.
I do think that listen is a constant theme here, rather than try to look for other things like signs and whatnot.
Yeah.
The message is always, what my son does is going to be an ear thing and not an eye thing. He's going to give you some signs. You're going to see some miracles. You're going to watch prophecy being fulfilled. But the power of the Holy Spirit is going to come from his mouth. And it's going to come out in the word of the gospel. So you need to keep listening to him and stop kind of going along with what everybody else is doing, the Pharisees and Sadducees and whatnot, and demanding visual signs.
By the way, this is super Old Testament too, because not just because Moses and Elijah are there, but because what he doesn't do here, because like what you're going to hear, if you're not careful, is you're going to hear do what he says, which is not what he says. So in the Old Testament, like all these times where you have like this word obey in the Old Testament, which is which means listen, because there's not a word in Hebrew for obey. So if you're reading the Old Testament and you see like obey my word, what it really says is hear or listen to my word. And
Heed.
And this is what God is always after. He's always just after your ear, right? Because what God knows is that like being told to do something won't result in you doing it. Instead, what has to happen is that you have to have, through the power of the word, your heart changed, and this might actually produce some fruit. And so what God is after is not your actions initially. What he's after is your ear. Like if you would just shut up and you would listen, if you would hear what I have to say, this actually will produce something. And so, yeah, Scott, like this is an efficacy of the word thing. It's not just 100%. Simply, hey, I'm going to give you some instructions, go do it. It's like, no, I'm going to give you words to hear.
Well, and Paul clarifies this, right, when he says why, because faith comes by hearing.
Faith comes by hearing.
Yeah. He's like,
this is, you mentioned the concepts earlier, Dan, but this is just a great example of what it looks like to be a theologian of glory on Peter's part. He wants to stay up on the mountaintop where things are pretty glorious. That's his natural tendency. This is again, so he's still not really hearing what Jesus had just said to him about dying to his illusions about the Messiahship. He wants glory.
He's just also the one guy in the crowd that can never shut up.
He's literally like, guys, like we're in the presence of the Trinity here, and he's like, no, you're not.
Yeah. And you're going to see. I know we're out of time for the most part, but you're going to see in the next passage what it looks like to be a theologian of the cross. And so, again, you're going to see this contrast between what you want to do. You want to stay up on the mountaintop, but really you're being called back down into the valley to do the hard work of loving and serving your neighbor, whether they deserve it or not. And to that end, it is important that we end with the grace of God that Jesus shows, in spite of Peter's dumb idea and not getting things right. It does say in verse 7, but Jesus came and touched them, saying, rise and have no fear. He doesn't hold it against them. And indeed, when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. Again, that being placed there to remind us that ultimately what's important is not the law and the prophets compared to Jesus. Jesus is all. He is only. And that's what we need to see.
Yeah, that's exactly right, man. Well, all right, we got to leave it there. We are well out of time. We will pick it up next week, see what Jesus has to say to them about this experience, and then Jesus is going to get right back to work. We'll do that next week. I'll see you guys then.